Good evening. Welcome to the Thursday, May 24th, 2018 meeting of the Kensington Police Protection and Community Services District Board of Directors. I'm Board President Rochelle Sherris-Watt. Unfortunately, Board Director Len Welsh had a last-minute commitment and will not be able to join us this evening, but I will take roll call. Director Hasai?
Here.
Director Deppie?
Here.
Vice President Natoli?
Here.
All right, we will now take public comments on items not appearing on the agenda.
Good evening. My name is Ciara Wood, and many of you know me, actually. So, I was at a meeting recently, and there were some folks who were just in a tizzy that the fire district was looking into legal opinions about the park. And I said, no, that is not what is happening. And I know this because I sort of helped get the materials together to ask this board to look into it. In March of 1994, followed by June of 1995, the citizens of Kensington voted in 2 advisory votes in favor of buying both pieces of property. It was divided in 2. And the language of those advisory votes is available. Should the Kensington Community Services District create an assessment of no more than $39 per parcel per year for 30 years, in addition to the assessment which may be levied for acquisition of the leased area that includes the tennis court, tot lot, picnic area, etc., for the purchase of an additional area, approximately 3 acres, which includes the Jefferson School site, to preserve and use the area for community purpose, recreation, park, and open space, and to maintain control of the property in the Kensington community. This measure passed by well over 77.5%. The following March, we were very lucky. The election day was very sunny, and lots of people, of course, were out and about. And the ballot language read, to complete the 8.05 acre Kensington Park, should Kensington purchase from the West Contra Costa Unified School District a 2-acre parcel historically leased as part of Kensington Park, in addition to the 6-acre parcel which the district has contracted to purchase through a special assessment. This remaining parcel is located between Windsor and Arlington Avenue, south of the library and west of the tennis courts. The $695,000 purchase price would be financed through special assessment bonds. I also have the bond language, but before that, from the Outlook, the Vote Yes on Measure E ad, which specifically notes in its copy, and this was the community expectation, Measure E is your last chance to preserve the final 2 acres of Kensington Park's open space. A yes vote results in the ownership of a wonderful community park forever. From the bond language, and the bond was for $2,512,880.64. The bonds are to be issued to finance the cost of acquisition of land, to be used as a park and installation of certain recreational improvements, the project, to fund a reserve fund for the bond, and to pay the cost of issuance of the bond. It is my hope that these documents will settle the question that the park is held for the community and is not available to another agency for sale. And it is my hope that opinion will show this in time. If it does not, I believe there will be a fair to huge sized community reaction, and more than likely, a fair to huge size bit of community sense of betrayal. Because when we did this, when we campaigned for these advisory votes, that became for many of us the center of where our energies went. And as a community, to pass both votes by over 70%, I just think is something that it's part of our community legacy and that needs to be respected. Thank you.
Good evening, Lisa Corona. I'm here on behalf of the Kensington Improvement Club. We had a great deal of discussion about our interest and appreciation of the Kensington Public Safety Council, which the co-chairs are Peter Liddell and Katie Gluck, who are here this evening. We were very concerned that they do not get dues. They really work for the service of both the district, both districts, the fire and the police district. And we really felt that both districts should be supporting them by helping them to promote the programs that they organize and conduct. So we have a resolution that I'd like to read, and then I have copies to distribute to you as well. Whereas the Kensington Public Safety Council was formed in 2009 to help inform the Kensington community on matters of public safety and to teach residents how to make our community safer and prepare for major disasters such as wildfire and earthquake. And whereas the KPSC works in close collaboration with both the KPPCSD and the Kensington Fire Protection District, as well as the community, to identify critical safety issues and the experts who can provide the best information to the residents. And whereas the KPSC organizes and conducts community programs focused on preparedness and personal safety, the safety of structures, and the safeties of pets and animals. And whereas the KPSC is responsive to new ideas for programs that make the Kensington community safer. And whereas the KPSC conducts 4 to 6 community programs a year on Saturday mornings as unpaid volunteers and often contributes personal funds and resources. And whereas the meetings are attended by up to 100 people depending on the subject matter. And whereas the KPSC assists the work of both the police and fire districts by organizing and conducting community meetings that should normally be conducted by those agencies themselves, thus saving the district's resources for other important programs and projects. Now therefore be resolved that the Kensington Improvement Club recommends that both the KPPCSD and the KFPD post all announcements of the programs developed by the KPSC, a lot of acronyms here, on each of their respective websites. So the websites are actually another mechanism to increase outreach and better inform the community of these critical public safety and preparedness programs. And attached on the back is a sample of the programs that are conducted by the KPSC. So we hope that you will consider assisting this group of individuals who are working with both agencies on the behalf of the total community and those agencies, and help them get their message out about the important programs that they provide. So thank you.
I think that would go to our attorney. So I'm going to hand that to you to look at.
Oh, here then.
Yeah, okay, thanks. All right, other public comments? Thank you. Any other?
So anyway, this is just sort of some quick points.
Could you state your name, please?
No one else did, but sure, Cyrus Modavi.
Actually, yes, they did. Thank you.
Having gone over like the finance stuff and like just looked at the budget a bit and the matrix presentation, I find it mildly unconscionable that, you know, we are leaving the police understaffed. That has put them in a position where they are not as access to back.
Excuse me, if the comment is in reference to the matrix presentation?
It's not about the matrix presentation per se.
Okay.
I'm just saying in reference to having other things
Okay.
that have brought that up. And that the fact that we have so few police officers and that we are essentially making them run overtime, risking burnout and essentially just making them want to leave, we are in a position, oh, wow, I'm not having a good day. Sorry. Anyway, so my point is, I really don't think you are taking care of the police in the sense that I looked at the budget, and so the real thing that struck me was the recruiting efforts, that we had essentially allowance of $15,000 for it. Every other year, we've spent at least $3,000 on it, and for some reason, this year, we are projected only to spend $350. And we are in a year where essentially we've all admitted our police force is operating at 2/3 capacity, and this essentially means these people are pulling overtime to keep us safe and to run it so that all shifts are covered. And I do not see how that, we can all just stand here and say that is business as usual, because it really does not feel like you are aggressively looking out to solve this. And that's, I guess, really the gist of what I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's empty.
Dave Spath. I wanted to compliment the board and the police chief on starting up with Nixle and putting out some information, one on PG&E work, but more important from my perspective, because I only live about half a block from where there was a fire the other night, and it did occur at 1:40, I believe, in the morning, so I didn't expect a Nixle notice within the next few minutes, but it came out shortly thereafter, in a sense, in the early morning, so I appreciated that very much. Also, you may want to consider, following up on Lisa Corona's comment, to use Nixle to share information on, for example, the Kensington Public Safety Council meetings. Other jurisdictions use it that way, certainly Berkeley does. And so I think that might be another useful way from the standpoint of public communication through the use of Nixle. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any further comments? All right, we'll move on to board member comments. Are there any? Go ahead.
I have two comments. One is I met with Chief Hull and Fernando Valdez from the county Public Works about the intersection at Highland and Almont. That's on the north side of the school. And we asked that we have signs on Highland that would only be drop-off, and to remove the sign that allows 5-minute parking on Highland, and on Almont to have that be allowed for parents to park, and to remove the no unintended vehicles from the poles there. Also, we talked about putting another pedestrian crossing sign that can actually be seen by people turning right from Highland onto Almont. And so that's in the works. And then we also met with the principal afterwards and let her know about these improvements so that they can put that in the announcement for parents starting in August with the new school year. And then separately, the compost survey closes on May 31st, and we'll likely have a meeting on July 12th, excuse me. And we will talk about the containers, which primarily for worker safety, because we don't use mechanized pickups in Kensington. We use semi-automatic, and there is a loading mechanism that these carts can be used to load onto the trucks. And I talked to Bayview today that it would likely be, people would be given the option of a 35-gallon or 65-gallon cart, because a 65-gallon cart is pretty large. But on the other hand, it contains a lot more, and they were pointing out that with everyone ordering online, all the cardboard, the 35-gallon container can be filled up pretty quickly. And then if people really don't want any of the carts, they can opt out of that. But there's no cost if you get the cart in, with this initial rollout, if that's what we choose to do. So those are my comments.
Other board member comments? I would like to announce that the finance meeting will be next Wednesday, room 3, that's May 30th at 7 p.m. Board, staff comments? All right. All right, seeing as there, oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. I would just like to speak to the gentleman's statements concerning staffing. First of all, I'm happy to announce that our newest officer, Nath, is now off of field training, so he will be operating as a solo officer. So you should be seeing very soon more patrol. Secondly, we have received, or I have received, 3 more applications for people that are interested in jobs working in Kensington. So the recruitment process has movement where we are vetting the applicants, and so far we've met success with Officer Nath, and I'm hoping to meet the same kind of success with the other applicants that we have in. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the consent calendar. We have the draft minutes from the April 12th, 2018 meeting. Are there any comments on those? Board member comments? All right, then I'll make a motion that we approve the consent calendar.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? All right, the consent calendar passes 4-0. Now we move on to what's old business, but it's really a new presentation. As everyone probably knows, that we have hired Matrix Consulting to do a study of our, I want to say dispensation, but our police services and how we provide public safety to the Kensington community. And Mr. Pipkin and Mr. Brady are here to present the Phase 1 findings. So, thank you.
Good evening again. I am Richard Brady, President of Matrix Consulting Group and the project manager on this assignment. And with me is Byron Pipkin. We're 2 of the 4 people who have been working on this assignment for you. This is my 4th time making a public presentation here. I'm feeling like a regular. So thank you for having me back again. So we're at a crucial stage of our project where we have completed our assessment of the existing police services in Kensington before we start looking at alternatives. And this was an important starting point for us. So what I'd like to do is present our still draft report. It's not finalized, and it won't be until we've gone through the reviews tonight and over the next few days, and we're still reviewing data that's within it. And give you a short presentation of the findings, conclusions, and recommendations that we've made within it. So I'd like to start out and remind everybody about the structure of this study and where Phase 1 fits into it. Phase 1, again, is a study of the existing police services. So it's as if we were doing a management, staffing, and operations studies of a police department in a community. And these are the kind of things that we do all over the country. It's important here because this study in Phase 2 will be looking at alternatives. So it was important in the design of this study to make sure that we looked at the strengths and improvement needs within Kensington's existing police services to make sure that we've got an efficient and effective and a well-staffed, community-oriented police force against which to view any alternatives to that, either improving existing services or looking at the contractual kinds of alternatives that we've been asked to do. So within this Phase 1 study, the goals were really to look at what the community needs were, and I'll talk a little bit about how we have done that up to this point. To do a management, operational, and staffing assessment of police services, and as part of this, develop a basis based on best practices of how Kensington's police services should be structured, how to be oriented, how they should be staffed, and how they should be managed. And that is a foundation to look at any police service for this community, whether it's the existing one or any of the contractual alternatives that we were looking at. So in our scope of work was, first of all, to look at the police services within the community right now, to look at the call for service workload that's generated from the community, to look at what officers are doing when they're not responding to calls, to look at training, to look at the various programs that they're involved with in the community, to look at how they're managed and how they're administered. We went to the community twice. We had 2 Saturday morning community meetings to get from you and many others, because I think there were over 200 people at each of those meetings, what was important to you in police services in terms of evaluating the current services that are provided, gaps between the services that are provided and what you would like to see, and that was important for us. It essentially validated much of what I think is the scope of work for this project. Then we evaluated current police services and looked at what appropriate staffing should be, looked at important issues about managing field resources, to look at management and leadership within police services, and how they should be professionally supported through training. And then we developed this draft report and soon to be a final report. So I think the public input, again, is really important. Sure, we had a scope of work that was developed in the request for proposals that were responded to several months ago before we won the study. But the 2 community meetings we had were really important for us, because police services today are not just about uniforms responding to problems that people have in the community. It's about a partnership with the community. It's about working with the community to meet their needs, and especially in a small suburban community like Kensington, that tie needs to be important, because a lot of quality of life issues need to be addressed, whether they're quote code enforcement or quasi-code enforcement types of things, certainly traffic and some other things, were major concerns expressed by you that we needed to understand. So the prioritized things that we got from those meetings included making sure that there was adequate staffing, the improved traffic enforcement, improved training for officers, improved professionalism and high-quality officers serving the community, rapid response times for high-priority calls particularly. There were some concerns expressed, basically concerns about property crime in the community and other things, especially traffic, were pretty consistently noted by the community in the meetings that we had. Against that, we looked at the data in terms of crime, in terms of community requests for service, and other activities that they had. And it's important to recognize that this is a very safe community. In fact, it's one of the safest communities in California as measured by major crime, and the FBI defines these in the same way for all communities around the United States. And violent crime, even assaults and certainly homicides and robberies and things like that, are very rare here. The last 3 years they've occurred basically once every 6 months. But even property crimes are relatively rare here, happening about every other week, a felony for some kind of property crime, and most of those are thefts, and very few of them are burglaries. So these are important findings. I think when we looked at the crime index against other communities in California, you're in the top 7%, which is something to be proud of in terms of your community and what you want to protect working with your police service. Your requests for service are also very low, even apart from crime. For whatever reason that you call and request assistance from the police, it's basically happening about 4 times a day, and I'll explain a little bit more about that a little bit later. So workloads here are low in support to the community, and which gives them a lot of time to be creative and to work with you in innovative ways to meet your needs in other kinds of ways. So as we looked at the strengths of the department, there are many. And going back to the community questionnaire that we used especially, but also the 2 community meetings we had, give us a lot of support for the good things that the police service is doing here in Kensington. When we looked at the questionnaire, almost everybody felt safe. And we work for a lot of safe communities around the country, and especially in California, and most people don't feel like that right now. Only 2% of the people who responded to the community questionnaire, and there were over 600 responses, said that they didn't feel safe. 85% of the questionnaire respondents said their contacts with police officers was positive, that they felt like their problems were solved, that they were dealt with respect, and other things that they passed on to us. 78% defined police services as responsive to the community in terms of meeting the needs when they responded, that they met expectations about how quickly they got there and things like that. Let's talk about response times, because I know that that has already generated some interest around here. They average 14 minutes, which is about half dispatch time, the elapsed time between when you call up emergency communications and request a service and the dispatch of an officer, and then the second half being the elapsed time between the dispatch of an officer and the arrival at the scene. That may seem like a long time. For the kind of calls that you have, it's expected. It's expected for a number of reasons. First of all, the road network, now that I've driven around here quite a bit, you would not want to drive with lights and sirens very often. You would be more of a danger than whatever it is you are probably calling for. But you shouldn't drive with urgency for many of the calls that occur. And so for lower priority calls, in most communities around the country, travel times are much longer than that, in fact. The queue time, what's called the queue time, the elapsed time between when you call and the dispatch of an officer, is something you need to work with Albany on. It's a little long, it may be illusory, but the data that comes from the computer is pretty clear in terms of when a call comes in, that triggers a time element. In terms of when an officer is dispatched, that triggers something else in the computer system. So the data is probably relatively good, but it's not where it should be. So we have some thoughts and recommendations on that in terms of working with Albany. But I just want to assure people that for the type of call composition that you have in this community, and for things like the topography and the road network and things like that, it's not a long response time, and that for the very few higher priority calls that occur, those response times are indeed much quicker. A consequence of not having a lot of requests for service, even with the staffing levels that you have right now, is that police officers have a lot of time to be, quote, proactive, unquote. And what we call proactive time is the time that officers have, A, not responding to calls for service, and not doing some administrative type of thing like briefing, servicing their vehicle, and things like that. For us, and for many researchers in law enforcement, this is one of the most important things, one of the most important indicators for effective law enforcement in America today. If you're just focusing on response times, you're focusing on things that happened 5, 10, 15 minutes ago. But proactivity is meant to work with you on recurring problems in the community, to get out of the car and to talk to people about the problems that they have, to work with a school, to work with elected officials, to work with community groups. And that's where the creative part of law enforcement comes in. And they have ample time in police services, even with the current staffing levels that they have, to do that. But the current staffing levels do create some problems. Before I move to what those issues are, in the handout and also in the report, there's this chart that we have in there that's all green. And it shows that every time block, every hour of the day, every day of the week, that officers have at least 70% of their time to be proactive, to be engaged with the community. I don't think, there's only one, or there's like 3 time blocks in the entire week that don't have 60 or 70%. So this is an extraordinary wealth of time that your police officers have to be engaged with the community and to solve your problems. So, and most departments around the United States would be very envious of this situation. The common problem in the United States is that there's a lot of green at 2 o'clock in the morning and not a lot of green when people are awake and needing help and other people are causing problems. So that is an important strength that you have within this police service here. So let's talk about what the issues are. And as has been discussed in our 2 community meetings, was even brought up in the public comment a few minutes ago, staffing shortage is a significant issue for the department. The person that just came out of field training makes 7 out of 9. For most of the time that we have been working here, it's been 6. And at that level, you cannot staff 2 people around the clock. And in order to be in business of being a safe, effective police department, you need to have 2 people. We'll talk about that more in a second. The last time I think you were at full staffing was 3 or 4 years ago, 2015. Most hours of the week, in fact, about 60 hours, 60% of the hours in a week, only have 1 officer deployed out there. It's come down a little bit lately because the chief has flexed his hours so that he's covering a weekend day. But during much of the week, there's only 1 person there, and there's certainly no guarantee that that 1 person is a supervisor, which is a separate and important problem as well. So, number 1. Number 2, I mentioned that there's a lot of time to be proactive, and as I said, I describe that as a luxury for this department. They need to improve their use of the proactive time so that it is structured to meet your needs. It's not random in terms of driving around the neighborhoods, as valuable as visibility is. But if you direct it based on input that the community provides to the chief and to the board and to the general manager, using information about the problems, the complaints that people have about problems in the community, and spending their time being deployed in areas where there are problems or working with the community to understand problems that they're having, that's a better use of that time. Right now, one indicator of the effective use of proactive time is counting things that they do with that. And that's not as perfect a exercise as looking at calls for service, because a lot of proactive things aren't counted. But there's only, right now, until recently, there have only been about 4 officer-initiated activities, roughly equal to the number of calls for service a day. It's recently gone up to 10 or 12, something like that, and you need to make sure that there's more activity in terms of traffic, other kinds of things that they're doing. So that's an important issue too in terms of management and supervision of police services in order to meet your needs. Thirdly, training is an issue, and I think you'll see that all of these issues are linked, because it's hard to break people away to get trained if you are inadequately staffed. It's hard to come up with what the problems are in the community if you're in the field all the time. But that is an important issue, and it gets at the professionalism that the community recognized in the community meetings, as well as best practices in law enforcement today. The 6-minute queue time, the 6-minute dispatch time for Albany is an issue. And lastly, I'd want to mention that compensation is an issue. One of many elements in recruitment and retention is compensation. And in terms of your local market area, the communities that are around you, your salary levels are about 3/4 of what theirs are. So that's going to be a factor. So what are we recommending in this? First of all, again, to be in the business of being a safe for the officers, safe for the community, law enforcement organization that allows you to do the things that I've been talking about here, being proactive, being able to train, being able to be focused on professionalism and managing police service, you need 2 sworn people around the clock. And that's going to mean 9 people, the chief, 4 or 5 sergeants, 4 police officers, and even that needs reserve officers and more reserve officers in order to fill gaps when there are leaves for sickness or vacations or something like that. So you're going to need to make additional efforts to make sure that you are able to attract and retain staff and reserves so that you are closer to authorized staffing levels. Because I think getting to the point that the gentleman made at the beginning, you're actually not using that much overtime. You're making the choice that you're actually only having 1 person out in the field rather than using excessive overtime in order to get to that level. The standard for effective law enforcement agencies in terms of training is 40 hours per year. And you are basically meeting state minimums of about 16 hours a year. And that affects not just the officers, it affects supervisors who have special needs for training, for individuals who are involved in following up on crimes for investigations of cases. They need special investigations, and the chief, who is still an interim chief, was a sergeant until he's made interim chief, needs management training as well. There's some equipment issues that are best practices today for accountability and transparency. Body-worn cameras are becoming a standard in law enforcement, and you should spend the money to do that so that there's transparency in terms of the community interaction with the officer and the officer's interaction with the community. Tasers would be an important thing too, to look at non-lethal forms of force, even though it's the rare time that they would be used. Next, provide the chief with, as I mentioned, management training and I think mentorship. Have a process where a former chief or even an existing chief is spending some time with your interim chief and bringing him along faster, because in this situation he didn't have an opportunity to get the kind of management training that a career is often dedicated to in a larger department. So you need to jumpstart that. Some more administrative help is needed, maybe just a half-time position to help support the department in locating training opportunities, in assisting with recruitment and career development types of opportunities, to help with the interface with the community so that we're able to figure out what the problems were, and to help support police officers in the field as well as the community in making sure that problems that you have get to police officers. We've laid out a process in which the chief, the general manager, and the board and the community develop a strategic plan that is driven from within the community, so that you have a series of community meetings where you're doing some of what we did in the two previous meetings of identifying what the problems are that need to be addressed, what kind of time and staffing efforts need to be directed at them, how you're going to make police officers accountable for meeting those community needs and reporting back to the community and to the board on a regular basis, and to formalize the roles between the chief, the general manager, and the board. And right now, you're below critical mass. It's important to recognize, and it's upset a lot of things, not just the service to the communities I mentioned, but also the effective functioning of a board as a policy-making organization, as a police chief who's able to function as a police chief, and a general manager providing some oversight. So getting the staffing up to authorized levels, having them more trained and professional, and then having the strategic plan with the community all come together to more effectively manage the police force here. So the cost of all of this, of course, is nothing that solves problems as major as yours without a price tag. And we're still working with the numbers. It's one of the elements of this being a draft report. But our estimate at this point is that all of the things that I've discussed would cost about $1 million a year on top of what you're spending right now. And it's a little more complicated than that, because it's not just the budget, it's what you're expending. And because of the fact that you're down so much, you've got some salary savings. Some of that is used for overtime and other things, but there's some savings on that as well. But the salary and benefits of the new positions would be about over $500,000 a year. The equipment that we mentioned, if you leased it, which is what most smaller departments are doing now, because they maintain it and you don't have to worry about that, is about $37,000 a year. The enhanced training for the officers and the chief would be about $80,000 a year. Additional reserve support would be about $20,000 a year. Some additional vehicle operating costs of about $24,000 a year. And that gets you to about $700,000 a year additional. So if we're assuming that compensation is part of the equation of recruitment and retention, getting you closer to your market salaries would increase that cost differential to about $1 million a year. So that's what we've come up with. So that's our study in a nutshell. I think there's some copies. There were a few copies in the back. I think it's online as well, and I'd like to answer questions that the board has now. Thank you.
All right, board questions? Is there any?
I can start. I have a couple. I've marked them right into the report, so just give me a moment. You talked about, it's on, sorry. Okay, thank you. You talk about that some of the information was not available from Kensington on how officer time is accounted for, and you said that in existing information on some of these additional workload metrics is unavailable. And I was wondering what some of those metrics might be and how other departments keep track of them.
Yeah, and thank you. This is an important question to me, and it does affect most departments. I mean, one of the reasons why we distinguish between community-generated calls for service and officer-initiated activity is that if there's a telephone call and a dispatch of a unit, there are going to be records. People are going to generally call for police help when they've got an important problem, important to them, and they need to have it solved. So, and you have to do something about it, so it's going to be counted. Proactive activities can be a little bit different. Yes, there are going to be things like a traffic stop or some, other kinds of traffic situations. There are going to be situations like there's a spill or something and the officer's the first on the scene and notices and they're going to respond and it's going to generate a report, a record to dispatch, et cetera. But a lot of proactivities don't have any kind of record. If you get out of your car and you're talking to a citizen, there's often no record. If it's 11 o'clock at night and you're going down Arlington Street where the shops and things are down there and you're checking the locks front and back, they're not going to count that. Many departments will count 10 of them rather than one because for each of the doors that they would check. So there's problems with counting it as well. So we're saying that if it's important for you to do something like checking the businesses in Arlington Street once or twice a night, that you should count it. Either radio it into the dispatch center or to keep an officer daily that counts that kind of things. If you're going to talk to a citizen, you can radio that in or you can keep a daily activity sheet that says that. So we're saying that as part of the metrics for the police department that you and the community should have, that those things that are important, community interactions and the few business checks that are safe and things like that, that you need to report back how often they've done it, that they've met your objective.
Some of the things you mentioned, it sounds like you have to use normative values for things such as report writing time, backup rate, and time on a backup. So those things are also not captured.
Right.
So, for example, report writing time, how do other departments, do they have timesheets where they log? I mean, I've worked in consulting where I have to count for every hour.
Yeah.
Do other departments require that, or
Most don't, actually.
Okay.
So we're using normative values, and let me tell you where we got the normative values. Sometimes our clients pay us to.
Yeah, because if no one is recording it, how do you get the normative value?
Because sometimes we're paid to actually get the stopwatch out and to do that. Okay. And then quite often we're asking in our employee surveys, we're asking them to estimate the amount of time it takes for them to write a report or to process arrests or something. And it's still pretty close. I think that anyway, that's how we do that.
Okay. And you also had net available hours per officer at 1582. How does that compare with other, similar type jurisdictions?
It's in the range. It's at the higher end of the range. Your problem is not in leaves. Your problem is that you have vacancies.
Right. Okay.
I'll follow up on that for a quick. Our problem, we do have vacancies right now, but in the past, we've always, over the last 2 years, we can look at or 3 years, we've often had 2 to 3 members of the force who were unavailable for work, either because of a particular type of leave. Is that a typical average? I mean, for us, that It's almost a third of our force.
Yeah, no, that's very high.
Okay.
And it's a problem with a very small force is that you even have one person that's out, and that's 1/9 is 11%. It's
Right. I just want to speak really quickly to that point. This is, I was doing some research a while back. It's been quite a few months, actually, but it keeps popping into my head. Kensington Police Department now at full strength. The Kensington Police Department lost no time in getting their force up to strength. Officer Keith Barrows completed his field training some weeks ago and is fully operational police officer. And it goes on with Officer Eric Stegman and another officer being hired. Sergeant Hull was commended for his exemplary performance as the acting chief of police, and a continued search for a new chief. This was written, it could have been written 2 months ago, in a way. It was written in October 2006. And this has been a persistent problem for our department, and this is one reason why I think the ad hoc committee suggested that we examine other options for, our own department and for other options, because we consistently face this problem of recruitment, retention, a small department staffing people out. So I just want to remind folks that it's pretty interesting taking a trip down memory lane, because it really could have been written, like, if substitute Officer Nath for Officer Barrows, and it just felt like very similar times.
If I can comment on that, I mean, your problems aren't unique in finding and keeping police officers. They're worse because you are the size that you are. But every department, or almost every department around the United States, is having problems recruiting police officers right
I'm very
now.
well aware of that. Two other things I just wanted to ask, as you go into phase two, I'd be curious, as you're looking at other jurisdictions and alternatives, to know about some of the things they're doing that you're recommending that we do. So, for example, any of the recommendations that you're recommending that we implement, things like a strategic plan, I would be wanting to know, does another jurisdiction do that? There was a series of metrics, some of which are easily available through our RIM system, but others which are not. But again, I just would say that that would be one kind of framework that I would like to see with all these recommendations as you proceed to phase two. I'd like to have answers to whether other alternatives, how they compare on some of these benchmarks.
I think that's a good point. That's one of the reasons why we went through that best practices assessment in the latter portions of the report, is to set that standard of expectations for somebody who would consider contracting with you, that these are the service expectations. Things like a strategic plan, reporting and transparency are very important.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions as well. On page 1 of your report, you talk about the data that you used, and you indicate other data from Kensington was limited, and I just wanted to make sure that you had access to all the data that you felt you needed.
Yes, it's been slow. I mean, one of the reasons why the cost data has varied in just the last week is that we've gotten some important data for last year's financials just in the last week about costs. So, yes, we have it. The RIMS data that we've got, the information we got from Albany, we feel is good data. And so the problem was more getting the financial data and scheduling and things like that.
Right, and I know you feel that the Albany data is correct, but as we talked about it before the meeting, Albany does not feel that the data are correct. So that needs to be figured out. Okay, let's see. The chart on page 11, I found, I couldn't figure out what you were trying to convey with that.
Oh, yeah, it is. I was looking at it before I came in here. It is kind of complicated. So we're trying to show when you, just on a scheduled basis, apart from somebody calling in sick, when you're going to have 2 people on duty versus when you're going to have 1 person on duty. That's what we're trying to show. And I take it that it doesn't very clearly do that.
No, and I can understand when you have 1 person on duty to have the red, but it's the gold that I don't quite understand the point that's trying to be conveyed here.
For its portion of the shift.
Yeah,
For the versus the entire shift.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand the red, that makes
Right.
sense, but the gold doesn't really communicate anything
Yeah.
to me.
That's a good point.
On page 13, it looks like we've got calls at 3 and 4 in the morning on a regular basis.
Not many.
I know, but I'm even surprised that there's that many.
At 3 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the morning, there are 7 calls for service all year in that time log.
Yeah, which is funny
It's
that.
the low point, that's why we highlighted it.
Oh, I see. I see. I would probably use a different color for that,
That's a good point.
yeah. Because I'm looking at the red at 3 and 4 in the morning and the red at 9 and 10 in the morning.
I think for us, what's interesting about that chart is that none of our clients have peaks at 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning. All of our clients have peaks in the late afternoon and the early evening, when they come home from work and something's missing or other kind of problems occur.
Okay.
Yeah, that's clearly what's happening.
Okay, on page 19, we pretty much talked about that. Never mind, I'm not going to bother with that. Let's see. On page 25, you talk about partnering with an adjacent agency to recruit potential candidates. I think that was going to be pretty self-defeating considering the salary differential between adjacent agencies and us.
That's why I say all of these things are linked.
Yeah. Okay, and then on the TASER recommendation, considering our crime rate, I'm wondering if that is a pragmatic recommendation, because I think about the BART shooting at Fruitvale where Johannes Measurely reached for his taser, what he thought was his taser, and instead it was his gun, and that ended up with a fatality. And tasers can sometimes have fatalities too, and I'm wondering about whether that really is considering the cost of that. The body cameras I can understand, but the cost of the taser, I'm really wondering if that makes sense.
Well, I think we're trying to broaden the spectrum of the tools that police officers have in any situation so that they're not having to resort to lethal force. I agree that their need to access any kind of force is extraordinarily rare here. And so I think in comparison to body cameras, I'd agree with you.
I do think that one of the points you made, though, is that because there's so little opportunity for constant practice of skills, that's why training is so important, so you don't
Exactly.
grab the wrong thing, because you're not using it so often,
Absolutely.
so training is even more important.
Right.
Yeah.
I wondered if the cost of administration for tasers and body cameras was included in your analysis.
The body cameras in part is a hidden cost because much of that review of body cameras is going to be a supervisory responsibility, a reason why you need to have adequate supervisors on duty.
Okay.
And the increased administrative time for purposes of redaction and public information requests, the press and things like that.
But it didn't include, like, the extra technological burden here in terms of security, computer support, those kind of things were not included.
They are. That's why
Okay.
we're suggesting that you lease it rather than buy it,
Okay.
because it's included in there if you lease it.
Is footage reviewed only in case of a problem, or is it reviewed regularly for quality, like training purposes and supervision?
Both. It would be on calls, and the chief and supervisor should regularly pull for 1 or 2 officers a month a certain number of segments of body-worn cameras.
On page 2, you say the most common requests are quality of life, and on page 14, you've got citizen assist as sort of the number one call for service. I'm curious, what's an example of a call for quality of life issue or citizens assist, besides, it's not burglary or whatever, it's,
Barking dogs, parking, those kinds of things. So mostly civil types of things, code violations, those types of things.
all right,
Arguments between neighbors?
Right.
right. And on page 20, it looks like the chart says that there's an extra patrol taking place every other day, is that right, essentially?
Yes.
Okay. So hopefully that, with all the extra time, that can be changed, I guess
I
is my...
think all of these could be changed.
Yes. Yeah, it seems like that the use of the proactive time, it sounds like it's getting better.
It does sound like it's getting better.
Right.
Just based on 1 month, it has gotten better. You got to make sure that that's all months.
Right, because I know a lot of people, me included, have been asking for extra traffic and patrol for a long time. And I'm glad that something's actually happening with that, because it's important.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been great working with you.
Thank you. We will take public comments now.
Will we be able to comment after the comments, or?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
There's more to
Great.
say.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for a nice report. My name is Greg Collis.
Could you state your last name? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Greg Collis, C-O-L-L-I-S. I'm a citizen of Kensington and a property owner. And it's very important to me that Kensington retain its individual and unique position. And part of that is the good works that I believe our police do now. I think there has been some problems in the past, but I think they're doing a lot better now. There's some issues and questions I have in the report, particularly the largest cost item appears to be having one staff officer and one sergeant at the same time. I believe this was tried about 8 or 9 years ago. I believe a number of the neighbors and citizens felt there was, and even the police felt there were too many people. And I believe that right now we work on a model that has on-call. Now, when you compared our alternative with your best practice of 2 people at all times with Albany, where the sergeant would be somewhere else, I don't think that's a fair comparison. I think you need to compare our model, where we have police on call for the sergeant job, rather than a separate police in a different district being the sergeant. Am I making myself clear? Okay. I also think that, sorry, I'm nervous. Okay, thank you.
There you go.
How's that? All right. I also think that in general, that we need police that are particularly able to understand our local problems. The other day I was walking up past the Unitarian Church, and an El Cerrito policeman drove past rather fast looking at his computer, and then drove real slow, looked at me, and sped away without saying hello. I think there's a qualitative difference between the impact of talking to the Kensington police and the El Cerrito police and the Albany police, and I don't see anywhere in our statistics that we're talking about issues that some of the other citizens brought up here, like racism, lack of racism here, what it feels like to have our policing here done the way it is now versus a change. So finally, I implore that if you make any recommendation for serious change, it'll affect my property value. We would like an opportunity to vote on it or to be assessed through a true survey so that you know where we all stand.
Thank you.
Celia Conkas. Excuse me. I'm not sure that I understand on page 9 what the police services specialist is. Maybe it was in the report and I simply missed it. So perhaps you could explain that to me.
So this chart is showing...
Please use the mic.
This is page 9.
Right. That's true.
Yes.
Yeah, so this isn't the department as it currently exists. It's the department that theoretically exists.
Yes.
And so it's a function, so it's a shared, it's the person who does property and evidence and things like that.
Is that, do we have enough?
Use the mic, Celia.
Is there enough need for somebody to be employed full-time for taking in evidence, and it seems an excessive amount of money to spend on a position.
There is not enough time for one person to be just doing that, but that person does other things. And I don't think that person's full-time.
But you are recommending, so we currently have a half-time police services specialist who works half-time, but you are recommending additional administrative. Is that based on implementing all these recommendations? For example, you use the particular example of if we needed to increase training, this role would be looking for those training opportunities. I mean, that person does do some of the training or booking of the training at the moment, but you're saying it's only would go to full-time if things changed?
Correct, and supported the community in a strategic planning process in terms of monitoring the kind of performance measures that you want to.
So the position would kind of change. I mean, you've also recommended that we contract out for evidence, for example, or other things. So it could be that that position, which is currently a half-time position doing certain things, could shift to a full-time position doing other things.
Correct.
Another observation I had is that although you mention here that salaries are low relative to other communities, there was no mention of the fact that benefits in this for the police officers are higher, and that has significant effect on the finances of the district and what we need to pay. And so I wish in some way that that could be mentioned. And the other thing I would hope to make clear was that the model that you have prepared here is not a personal or a company-wide recommendation, but rather showing what best practices might be, and that there will be another step. Because I think it is possible to misunderstand what was written and to for somebody to read this as this is the recommendation that Matrix is making. So I would like, if you don't mind, to have a clear statement that this is simply a model of what could be in the event that there were to be best practices and the flushest, cushiest police department or delivery for police services to Kensington. Yes.
So, for this department, for this size, a lot of these best practices are going to be minimal practices for you. They are where you need to be, certainly in terms of staffing, in order to be safe for the officers and safe for responses. In terms of things like training and other types of things, you need to make sure you've got a professional force. So this isn't cushy. This is the best practices that you need to be an effective law enforcement agency.
This, to me, would imply that we don't have a professional and effective law enforcement office. We're not delivering good services right now, and yet we have a very low crime rate. And we're all in agreement, and that's why I'm here, and a lot of other people. So there's somehow a little bit of a problem reconciling these two.
That's a very good point. So it's all about managing risks. You know, you could have low levels of training, and certain things can happen because of lack of training. You can have one person 24/7, and sometime there's going to be a problem associated with that. So we're trying to find a way in which you are managing those risks better. This isn't cushy. We're not saying you should have a chief, a lieutenant, a detective, and 10 police officers. We're finding a way to meet the staffing and the professional support that's needed in a reasonable way to manage those risks in the community in a cost-effective and reasonable way.
One last comment, and I have many in my head, but I don't want to take up too much time, and that is In overtime, overtime is not compensated in the same way and is not PERSable, if that's the correct word. I'm not sure that I know that. So that, in effect, having police officers who are serving, working here in overtime capacity, in fact, saves the district money. And if the officers didn't want to do it, I mean, it's possible that they would refuse, I don't know. But it is a consideration in this community, you know. We're all counting the money we spend on all the services here, so.
May I comment on that too?
Yes. I'm
So-
not seeing too much gray in this.
You will always have overtime in a police department. In any 24-hour operation, you will always have overtime. In fact, you spent, what is it, $173,000 last year on overtime? The problem is that with as many positions as you've had vacant, you're asking too much. Somebody earlier talked about burning people out. If you are down 40% of your workforce, you can't ask the other 60% to make up those hours, I mean, in a continual basis. So yes, overtime is less costly in California than straight time, but there are consequences with those decisions. If you get fully staffed at 10 officers and a chief, you'll still have overtime. But you won't be asking so much of them that they could be burned out working too many hours and not enough time to refresh, relax, get those kind of things.
I want to keep reminding everybody that we go over this over and over again. We were fully staffed at the number of authorized positions for most of the time that we've talked about, where we had people who were out. So we had, numbers fully staffed, yet not all available to work. And I think that's really crucial to talk about, because that has really been where we've been kind of handcuffed in a way, where we had, 10 authorized positions filled, yet 3 or 4, for various reasons, not able to work for a long time. So that's just a point we need to keep making over and over again.
Jim, could I just ask a clarification on Celia's talk before you go ahead? I just wanted to get a clarification on something Celia said before. Celia mentioned that our benefits are higher and the salaries are lower. I'm curious, as far as attracting officers, is salary a much more important thing than benefits? Or what drives people to come to a department?
A lot of things for different people. For millennials, it's mostly the salaries. And your extra pay for benefits, we will reflect this in the revised final report. The extra that you're paying for benefits does not compensate for the amount of the differential in salaries.
Okay.
Good evening, Jim Watt. So that our members from Matrix know, I'm on the Finance Committee for Kensington. So I'm here to talk about finance issues. I have some serious concerns about the conclusions that have been reached by Matrix concerning the proposed changes to the existing police services. And as you just heard, the costs associated with making those changes are going to be astronomical. Given the time constraints placed on audience comments, I can only touch on a few items that I'd like to start with an overview of how Kensington ranks in terms of major crime activity versus other low crime areas in Northern California. In the handout which I have given to you, has two sides. I have some more here if anybody wants to look at this. It has two sides. Let's start with the one with the completely handwritten. The first shows the communities in Northern California with the lowest number of major crimes in 2014. Kensington ranks second in this list, just barely trailing Los Altos Hills. And on a statewide basis, Kensington ranked number 3. In other words, Kensington is a very safe community. Near the bottom of this table, you can see that Albany has 3 times as many major crime rates as Kensington, while El Cerrito is 4 times higher and Berkeley is 5 times higher. Now turn over to the other side, which is a modified version of page 7 from the Matrix study. You will see that I have added years 2011 and 2017 in the Matrix list. This is well below the, in the Matrix. In the middle, you can see an orange line which shows the number of officers which were on duty in 2015, 2016, and 2017. This is well below the 10 allocated, especially in 2017, when the number of working officers was just 6.6. However, in spite of these officers' deficiencies, Kensington crime rate ranked exceedingly low, which certainly suggests that and proves that we live in a very safe community. So given this data, one would expect that an evaluation of the future makeup of the Kensington Police Department would conclude that we can possibly save costs instead of adding what we now hear might be well over $1 million. Here are some examples. Now that we have added a part-time general manager, one would think we could reduce police staff from 10 to 9 or 8 officers. Instead, it is recommended that we will add back to 10, we will go back to 10, of which 5 are senior officers, and that we will add a police service specialist. Number 2, it is further recommended that because Kensington is lacking in, quote, crime-fighting challenges, officers will now want to come here, will not want to come here, so we must provide a, quote, very competitive salary and/or salary bonuses. Number 3, we have operated with only 1 officer on duty between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. for many years because this 7-hour time frame typically represents only 10% of service calls. It is now recommended that we will have 2 officers on duty during this period, presumably so that they can keep one another awake. Number 4, it is recommended that we keep officers on a 12-hour shift, even though we know that putting officers on a 12-hour shift with occasional overtime and long commute times leaves them exhausted. Number 5, it is also recommended that officers spend 40 hours a year in training. It's also recommended that officers be given body cameras, tabors, and more effective information systems. I believe that these changes we already know that these changes will add significant costs to our current police operations. And because of the extremely low level of criminal activity in Kensington, it is hard to imagine what the benefits will be. I hope Matrix evaluation of contracting out is more informative. Thank you.
A. Stephen Stelk. Everybody understands that Kensington has been operating for years with less than 10 sworn officers recommended by consultant Brown Taylor in 2007. You also recommend 10. Your list includes the chief, 4 officers, a corporal, 4 sergeants. That is enough so that there is a 1-to-1 supervisor to officer ratio for every shift. I guess I don't really understand this required level of supervision for police officers, although I do understand that the KPD supervisors would also perform some routine patrol duties. Recently, KPD got down to just 6. The chief, 1 sergeant, and 4 others. You have focused your analysis on 5 patrol officers. Skipping something here because it's already been said. You calculated that collectively, the officers would have 81% free time for elective, proactive community policing activities. In 2007, Brown Taylor arrived at 81% for 8 officers, 70% for 5, based on considerations that are quite similar regarding the number of calls for service and the time per call. The green table that you have provided us from page 19 shows that with our current number of officers, there are only 2 periods out of 42 during the week when there is 50% or less discretionary time. Neither of these 2 periods is during overnight shifts when another officer is to be added. However, I do fully understand the safety reason for the second officer. Having 9 patrol officers will assure that at all times of the day and night, there is time for proactive community policing activities well above the standard of at least 40 to 50% for, quote, high service level residential communities, close quote, parentheses, such as Kensington. You, like Brown Taylor, found that our police KPD officers do not utilize the free time they already have. He made some suggestions, and you recommend the district improve this through development of a police strategic plan, perhaps in conjunction with a community action plan, which I hope you will tell us more about maybe in phase 2. You summarize by saying your recommendations will cost $1.25 million a year, and you've explained that that is in addition to what we are already paying. But since 10 officers are already in the budget, does this amount include filling 4 vacancies, or just the cost of the recommended promotions and other salary increases continual training and recruiting, more and better equipment, etc. And one final comparison between 2007 and 2017, serious crimes, those FBI Part 1 crimes, are actually down 30%.
Mabry Benson here. Mr. Brady, I guess in responding to Delk's questions, and this is one of my questions, when you are in your next stage, when you're proposing, I presume, not qualifications, I'm losing the word here, but what's needed for a contract. It would seem to me that if we were contracting out, we wouldn't need the staffing level that you are recommending for us as a standalone department, because we should be able to take advantage of the economies of scale of a larger department that would be providing a fractional cost of that police specialist that Celia was worried about, and the supervisory staff, because I know in El Cerrito, each supervisor supervises 4 officers, not just 1. You're shaking your head, yes? Good, thank you. Please include that point when you're making your recommendations in that respect as an alternative. Thank you.
Gail Feldman. I have a question. Maybe you might have addressed it before I came. Just as far as the 2 officers on duty at the same time, is that considered to be both on the same in the same patrol vehicle, or they could be in separate vehicles? Okay, I just want to clarify that. So then I have some comments about also about the financials in regards to the police officer salaries. As you know, the district over the years has done a number of salary studies where we've looked at comparing Kensington with other communities other than just the ones that are in the report. And those salary studies have been much more comprehensive as far as looking at the salaries as well as the benefits. And we all know that the benefits and the salaries are negotiated through collective bargaining. And so all those factors are considered in what the final package is for the officers. You know, surely had the officers decided in the past that they didn't want certain benefits, they may have seen the salary, that same amount of money go towards their salaries. So we have to look at it that way, and I realize that these other jurisdictions also offer benefits, and so again, it's really important to look also at total comp, not just the salaries, although I realize, as you're saying, that younger people are not so much looking at what they might get in retirement, but as you know, the district pays health care costs and through retirement, and that is extremely expensive, which is partly why the salaries have remained lower. So somewhere that has to be in this report, because you know, people in the community who are going to use this to decide, you know, where they might stand on an issue are going to look at this and say, like, why aren't we paying them more? And it's just not comprehensive enough. I also found it difficult to understand on page 24, where you do list, I mean, it's very helpful for you to list the hourly rates, that's pretty straightforward, but I'm not sure if you're comparing apples to apples, where you talk about the highest earning officers, but then you get to the Kensington officers and you say midpoint salary. So as long as you're going to do, this is helpful to have, but I think you just need to be consistent that it's all midpoint or it's all, you know, lowest step or whatever you're going to do. So I'd like to see that clarified in there. Also on the recommendations, so you do identify an amount of money that you think it would cost to bring the officers' salaries up, but you don't really explain where that would bring the officers to. for one thing, so that needs to be clarified further. What would $500,000 get us to? Again, really, is that also just the salaries? Does that include all the benefit costs that get accelerated once you add the salaries? So that needs to be clarified for people. That would be very helpful. So I hope that you can address that in your final report.
To tack on to Gail's question, so my assumption was there were no PERS considerations added to the cost. Because I know PERS is very changeable.
It is. No, this was just salary. And,
Okay.
we're not doing your negotiation for you. We're sort of guessing what it would be, what it would take to get it to something like the midpoint of the immediate surrounding areas as an illustrative point.
Thank you.
Before you leave the mic, just wanted to ask Celia's clarifying point. So the $500,000 you were talking about, did that take into account what we currently budget and then add on top of that?
Yes, it does.
Yes, right, okay.
Dave Spath. First of all, I'd like to compliment Matrix on a very comprehensive report. It was very well done. I think people have to recognize that, as Mr. Brady said, this is best practices, and from the standpoint of staffing, it's best practices staffing. And as I understand it, from the standpoint of supervision, it's important to have supervision on all shifts. And as I read your report, you also seem to suggest that that sergeant would also be involved in activities that a regular field officer would be doing as well. So one question that comes to mind is you look at some of the other jurisdictions, such as El Cerrito and Albany, which presumably would approach contracting in a model where we would be a beat of their existing beat. How does a supervisor within that jurisdiction fit consistent with what you're recommending for best practices here in Kensington? That supervisor, let's say a sergeant who is overseeing maybe 4 other officers, could not be providing the same level of patrol and other community activities that you would envision for best practices for a standalone department. Am I correct on that? Yes. Secondly, with regard to benefits, let me be clear, and we've discussed this many times before, the benefits for officers who are active are no higher, no better in terms of medical and retirement than existing jurisdictions. Where we, and I think we need to deal with this, is on retiree medical benefits, where we pay for both the retiree and spouse. And that's a negotiable issue, and I think, as I've mentioned before at previous meetings, that is something that needs to be negotiated in the future under a different model that wouldn't necessarily affect existing officers, but any future officer. I would certainly recommend that you set up a different model where we don't pay for retirement benefits, but we provide the opportunity for putting money into a program that would pay for their or contribute towards their medical benefits into the future. You also presuppose that with the $1 million increase that we would increase salaries. That I don't think is necessarily a foregone conclusion. I appreciate the fact that Kensington is about 25% lower in salaries and will be even higher because El Cerrito just consummated a contract with their officers which will result in a 6% increase in salaries over the next 2 years. So we're going to be even further in difference, shall we say, from salaries with certainly El Cerrito. I don't know about Albany. So there are a lot of factors to consider. I understand that $500,000 is probably related to the sergeants who would therefore incur a higher salary burden on Kensington. So that is an issue, and I agree with Mr. Watt that is, in Gail Feldman, that is an issue that needs to be looked at closely. But at the same time, we are dealing with professionals in the field who are making recommendations for best practices, and I think we should look at that very closely and not try to second guess them. One thing I would like to ask you, this document that Jim passed out, Jim Watt, uses a metric called crimes per thousand population. I would like to ask you if that is a reasonable metric to use. As I saw on your website, you suggested that that was not a very good metric to use for, but maybe you could explain what that is.
Good research on our website, thank you. No, we recommend a metric that is often used in law enforcement of officers per thousand, not crime per thousand. Crime per thousand gives you a sense of magnitude adjusted for population, but we argue strenuously in much of our work that officers per thousand obscures differences in community, topography for one, crime situation for another, use of civilians, different kinds of response policies, et cetera. So officers per thousand is very meaningless, but crime per thousand gives you some sense of magnitude of a community that's twice your size, may have 3 times the crime that Kensington has.
So when you say on your website that that's not a good metric, then that...
No, we're saying officers per thousand is not a good metric.
Right, but on your website you say, I thought you said, well, anyways, I won't belabor the point. But anyways, I think you've done a very good job with this first phase, and I look forward to the second phase as you evaluate other jurisdictions. Thank you.
Hi, Kevin Fitzsimmons. Just 3 real quick questions. You mentioned the 2017 Pew Research. Hi, Kevin Fitzsimmons. 3 questions. Is that good? Oh, so as they say on Verizon, can you hear me now? Yay, okay. He works for a different phone company now. So 3 quick questions. You bring up the 2017 Pew survey study with the 93% of officers reporting that their colleagues are worried about their personal safety. And I was wondering, in a community like Kensington with its safe reputation, if our officers report a similar experience as well. I notice it's extrapolated, but I don't see any actual interview here. Second question. With body cams, does that have any impact on litigation against police officers? Has there been any research done on that? And third question, as we go into the second phase of the analysis, will there be more public meetings like we've been seeing on Saturday morning? Thanks.
So we did ride along with several of the officers and talk to all of them. There's so few of them, we can't report what came in those interviews without violating confidentiality. However, yes, this is a very safe community, and they're unlikely to have the kind of fears that in a larger community with more crime would have. However, it was mentioned to us in several of our interviews that one person out there is an issue and a risk for them that they were conscious of. On duty.
No.
That the practice of having one person on duty represented a potential additional risk for them. Sorry.
Not one particular Kensington resident, yes.
Right.
If that's the situation, we're buying them a plane ticket somewhere else and we're going, but no, it's just, yes, having one officer at a time.
So the experience with body-worn cameras has gone both ways. Often with the evidence of body-worn cameras, complaints dissipate. So it's transparent, and it could work both ways. What was the third one? Oh, more public meetings. That's yet to be determined exactly what form we're going to have. But yes, with the second phase, there will be some form of public input, either another Saturday meeting or a venue like this.
I'd like to, please come, address just body cameras. We did some initial investigation, this board, in 2016 about body cameras. And while there can be decreased litigation once they're implemented, there can be litigation before they're implemented. There's privacy concerns and data control issues. So there are costs that can come, there are cost benefits, but then there could become costs from other venues that you wouldn't necessarily think of just first off. Please.
Yeah, Lisa Corona, I'd also like to thank you for this thorough report. I thought it was very informative. And I think, to me, it answers the question, if you want your own standalone police department, what are the best practices? And there's some, wiggle room here and there, but I think it lays out the basic framework for what that story is, including the $1 million. So that's one thing. But one thing that, because of the need to have the supervisor on at all times and staffing for 2, and given the incredibly low case load at 2 in the morning, what kinds of other activities can the sergeant be doing when they are not called for an emergency, because it's really kind of emergency backup and assistance, consultation, but when they're not doing that, how many of the other activities in terms of, the records keeping, the evidence room, the handling, some of the burden of what's now put onto the administrative position increase could actually be taken over by the downtime in those circumstances? And have you looked at that, I guess? Or would you look at that?
The supervisor on duty would be a fully functioning officer and would perform every function that the patrol officer does. The one difference is that that person is accountable for the shift and for everything that occurs, and you have clear lines of responsibility to manage risk. That's the most important reason for having a supervisor. In law enforcement, you have to have a supervisor on duty 24/7. So the minimum standard for any police department, Kensington is a small department. You do not need 2 staff on duty to handle the workload. You need 2 staff because that is the absolute bare minimum for a standalone police department. And you'll notice in the report, we don't recommend a detective position. We believe that there's enough time for officers and sergeants to investigate their own cases and to have time with their shift to do that and other functions. So what other functions need to be done, they could do, because currently they have 81% proactive time. If this is implemented, you have 2, their overall average proactive time is going to go up. They're going to be in the 90% range of proactive time and available time. So they can do whatever needs to be done.
I wanted to just clarify one thing, because I've heard a couple of times people sometimes say, oh, couldn't the police officer do the evidence? But I understand that it is absolutely best practice that officers do not log in and touch evidence after they've brought it in, because there's issues around that. So that's just one function that they couldn't do. And I want to clarify then, if there was a model where a supervision was provided in another way, are you saying then that one officer could be on duty with available backup and supervision provided somewhere else, that one officer, given our current sort of the profile of the community, as long as they had backup available and supervision somewhere else, that could work? That's what I understood.
Yes.
Okay. And lastly, on the issue of proactivity, I mean, it's wonderful to have all this proactive time. And I'm not saying we don't have any problems, but to have 90% of proactive time in a community with so little crime or other problems that require law enforcement to address, that's also just something that sort of strikes me. For example, would love to see a lot of hardening of targets, crime prevention, community work, but that only takes so much time. So that just struck me as very glaring here.
Right. There will be downtime, no doubt about it.
Okay to have downtime, but it's just like.
A lot of downtime.
Right.
Let me say something about that. So, I mean, Kensington is so small that you aren't staffing for the workload. You are staffing for the risk and for the safety considerations. And high amounts of proactive time are a consequence of that. So that gives you an opportunity as well. The proactivity, the hardening of targets. The administrative demands of a 10-person police department aren't a lot different than the administrative demands in a 30-person police department that has administrative staff. So things need to be done relating to record keeping, relating to training, relating to analysis, best practices, those types of things. And during that downtime, sure, you don't have to be in the field, but you can be available to do those kinds of collateral kinds of duties that are important for any police department to maintain.
Thank you.
Yes, of course, you just have to come up to the microphone.
Hi, thank you. I'm just a little confused. I've heard that it is a best practice to have a supervisor on duty or on duty somewhere else, or in the past we used to do it on call, or it is a requirement, or it isn't. And I'm not sure, where does the requirement come from in your quote, in your document about best practices and why we should have it? All you do is have a little statement about what a sergeant's supposed to do. So is it a requirement that we have an on-duty sergeant? Is it a requirement that he be local? What is the true rules and what is best practice? What's going on?
It's a best practice and it's essential to have a supervisor on duty. In a 10-person police department in Kensington, that person would be here for all the reasons that we have been saying. If you were part of a larger service area in a contractual situation, and Kensington would essentially be a beat, then yes, you would have a sergeant in a more purely supervisory role in the area. And that's why when we were in the community meeting last time, we were talking about the assumptions that would be important to consider in a contract, that's why adjacency was so important. If you are adjacent, and that's obviously only Berkeley, Albany, and El Cerrito, then you would have a sergeant who would be proximate to be able to back up and respond and observe the Kensington people who were being deployed. And if it wasn't an adjacent community, then that person would be here. Let me put this in another context, in the context of what you've got right now. As you go from a department of 6 or 7 police officers to 9 or so, and even with the officers you've got right now, you've got a very young force. Very young force. People who haven't been in law enforcement for more than a year or two. They need senior, experienced people who are available to help guide them in their general career, but also how to be police officers and how to interact with the public, how to write a report. Yeah, at 4 in the morning, at every time.
Thank you. All right, are there any other?
I just wanted to mention that, there's a discussion about always having 2 officers on duty. I went to a presentation when Kevin Hart, I think maybe Dave was there, when he first started, and that was one of the first things he said was, you really need to have 2 officers on duty at all time. He made that point, and I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to the Brown-Taylor report before then. So it was the first time I had heard it, and I was a little, I don't know, I wasn't convinced completely, but you're saying the same thing, and it sounds like other people have said the same thing. And so you're not the first people that have said this, obviously. So I guess what you're saying is we're battling economies of scale. There's a minimum of what it takes to run a police department, whether you've got 1, 10, or 100, and we're so small that our requirements are such that it makes it look like it's overkill or whatever, but that's just because we're so small. I'm assuming that's, okay.
Mr. Brady is nodding. Let me note if he's... All right. Well, we thank you. I think as we move forward, it's all going to be about balance, and we want you to know tonight we are here to listen. Outside of the two board members that were working with Matrix, the rest of the board got this on Monday, just as you all did. So we are moving forward and considering all the options you've given us, and we look forward to working on phase 2. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here and coming out to Kensington again.
Yeah. Why don't we take a 2-minute break and then come back and conclude the meeting? Sure. All right, we're resuming the meeting. We're going to continue on to item 6, new business. General Manager Constantoros is going to present the NBS Engineers Report for the Kensington Park Assessment District and 3 resolutions, 2018-01, 02, and 03.
Thank you, Madam President. This is something that's done annually by the district. And this year, the assessment for each dwelling unit is $17.24, which is an increase from last year's $16.65 assessment. This will result in 2,188 parcels that will be assessed, providing a total levy of $38,841. The funds are used mostly for pruning and maintenance. And the process is a 2-step process. The first step is the adoption of 3 resolutions tonight, the scheduling of a public hearing at the next board meeting on June 14, and adoption of a 4th resolution at that time at that June meeting. The notice for the public hearing has to be advertised in the local paper. So the resolution, the 3rd resolution you adopt tonight, will be published and advertised. The 3 resolutions are, the first one is a resolution of intent. The second one is the approval of the annual report, which is included in the agenda packet as an addendum. It's quite a lengthy report, shows the assessment for each of the parcels in the community. And the last resolution, 2018-03, is the resolution initiating the proceedings. By initiating the proceeding that allows the publication of the notice for the public hearing, and then the last resolution is adopted at the public hearing, and that's the resolution ordering the levy, but that is not done till the June meeting. And it is recommended that these resolutions be approved individually, 2018-01, 02, and 03. And I also need each of you to sign each resolution tonight after passage for our records and for the process for the public hearing. So with that, if there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
I just have one question on 1803. Number 5, the notice of public hearing, it says the hearing will be held on Thursday, June 7th?
Or later, I believe it says.
Right.
Right. So that's okay.
Okay.
I also think that the amount of assessment varies with the parcel. It's largely, each parcel is largely 1724, but I can see 6620 and 2648 on some of them, so, and 3448.
All right, if there are no public comments, board comments? All right, then I'm going to make a motion that the board adopt Resolution 2018-01, initiating proceedings for the levy and collection of assessments for the Kensington Park Assessment District for fiscal year 18-19.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Resolution 2018-01 passes 4-0. There were no no's, right? To make sure. I will now make a motion that we adopt Resolution 2018-02, a resolution approving the annual report for the Kensington Park Assessment District for fiscal year 2018-19.
I'll second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None? The motion passes 4-0. Now I make a motion that we approve Resolution 2018-03, in which the Board of Directors declares its intention to levy and collect assessments for the Kensington Park Assessment District for fiscal year 2018-19.
I'll second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The motion passes 4-0. All right, now we'll move on to item B. Tony will present the District Resolution 2018-04, ordering the even-year Board of Directors election.
Yes, this resolution actually has three parts. It orders the even-year director's election, the consolidation of elections, and the specifications of the election order. The election day would be the 6th day of November 2018. I think there's one typo on that. It's 2018. I think one of them says 1018, but it should be 2018. And the three directors' seats that are up for election are Director Rochelle Sherris-Watt, Director Len Welsh, and Director Christopher Deppie. So with that, I don't know if the General Counsel has anything to add to the...
No, it's a necessary preliminary to calling the election.
All right, are there any public comments? All right, board comments? None? Then I'll make a motion that we adopt Resolution 2018-04, which orders the even-year Board of Directors election, the consolidation of elections, and specifications of the election order.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
The motion passes 4-0. All right, well, that is our final activity this evening, so I thank you for sticking with us. And we meet again on June the 14th.
I'll move to adjourn.
I'll second that motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, the meeting concludes.
We have to sign.
It is 9:38 p.m.